We have a special second presentation for you today. Kathy Penn, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce her to you. She has published a book of her newspaper columns, and she describes that book as reflections on the simple pleasures in everyday life in stories about pets, holidays, loved ones, and more. And there's one section of her book I think that will resonate with us, and that's one that's called Proud to be an American, Patriotism, Parades, and Perspective. Kathy, we look forward to your presentation. Come ahead.
Thank you. I have to thank a few people before I get started, so I want to first thank Randall, who couldn't be with us, for agreeing to let me come speak today. So I appreciate that. I also would like to thank Rich for my introduction, and Larry Fry for allowing me to submit some of my patriotic columns for the revetments. So I really do appreciate that. Let me tell you guys, I am not going to speak for an hour, so put your minds at ease, okay? I also know that for me, this is nap time. Since I've retired, I like to take naps in the afternoon, so I appreciate you all being here. But you can't nap because I expect you to answer some questions I'm going to pose to the audience, okay? And I'm hoping I can turn this, that's a little bit better, and I can see you now. Okay, good. So let me start by saying, as Rich said, I've written one book, and that's when I said I would come and speak, and since then I've published another book. I'm going to talk to you about how I came to be a writer, because I wasn't always a writer, and I may read one selection from a book, and then we'll just go from there, okay? So, first of all, are there any writers in the audience? I know, Rich publishes in revetments. I can't see your name. Mike Kane, okay. You write for or have written?
I was a radio journalist.
Okay.
And I've written a few plays that haven't been produced yet.
That's okay.
There's always hope.
All right, so this man has written some plays and he was a radio journalist.
And I have a little book going, and it's called My Mother Was a Rat Terrier.
My mother was a rat terrier.
It's about a little dog who has adventures with his brother and sister.
I love it. So the dog wrote it. Okay?
The dog's point of view.
Okay, from the dog's point of view. And Larry, of course, you often publish in the revetments, right? Okay, okay. So, how about readers? Do I have readers out there? Raise your hand if you're a reader. Okay? All right. How many of you have been avid readers since you were a child? All right. Well, that's where I started. Okay? I think I've been an avid reader since the first moment my mother put a book in my hand. Who remembers the Golden Books? All right. I was just having a conversation with Judy the other night about Golden Books, and they were mentioning a few in the newspaper, and I said the one I remembered was Pokey Little Puppy. All right. What are some of the others that y'all remember? Think of any? Three Little Kittens was one. Okay. Yeah. You still have them? Okay. I don't have those, but I have. All right. And I went from there to The Cat in the Hat and all those books. Okay. Didn't have them all because I think they came in the mail then. And I just got, you know, I outgrew them, so Mother quit getting them in the mail. I don't know about my other sisters. Too bad about them. I was the oldest. One day, there was this big hoopla. Everybody gathered. They made homemade pasta, da-da-da-da. I always had my book. Okay. So, and my father was a huge reader. He read, if he didn't have a book to read, he grabbed the encyclopedia off the shelf. So I think that's why we three girls were always very disappointed if we ended up at a doctor's office or on a bus or somewhere without a book. And heaven forbid you didn't have a book to read. So I was always an avid reader. I wasn't a writer. Never thought about being a writer. And it's also very important to me that I'm Greek. I'm proud that I'm Greek. As a child, I also read every library book in PS 162 that was about Greek mythology. Okay, so I grew up in New York until I was 13. Actually, I was 12 when we started the move to Georgia. And I turned 13 in the hotel while we were waiting for the moving van to arrive in Georgia. All right, in 1967, when I was in the 8th grade, the most news that came out of Atlanta, Georgia was Lester Maddox and axe handles. Anybody remember that? Yes. Okay, it was just a little different back then. And I was from New York City, had moved to Long Island, and I was like, oh my God, axe handles? Now, my mother was from Macon. I mean, I knew about some of this, but it was a big shift. And in 1967, rock and roll, I had just gotten my mother to give me permission to wear hose. And I moved to Georgia, and people were wearing, so I enjoyed it, wool skirts and I don't know, I'm sure I brought my friend Beverly. I hope a lot of y'all have gotten to meet her. She retired after 30 some odd years teaching. When we first started teaching in DeKalb County in Georgia, you had 7 years to get your master's, or you couldn't keep your job. I don't think it's that way anymore. I think they have a hard time finding good teachers. So anyway, I still, got my master's, loved reading, still only wrote term papers. Left there, ended up working in corporate America. And believe it or not, a lot of people can't write a complete sentence or punctuate or know what a comma is. And I didn't realize that till I went to work in corporate America, and every job I had, they'd say, oh, Kathy can write that. And I guess they figured out I could write. The first thing I had to write that was of any length was the payroll manual. And Rich, you can imagine I hated that because it had to do, there was some math in it, but it was mostly do this first. Before you put it in the envelope, check it. They had not had a manual on how to do it. They just had the people who'd done it for 30 years. So I worked in corporate America for 32 years. And every job I had, they figured out I could write, even if it wasn't my official job. And then I worked in leadership training. I wrote leadership manuals, stood up and did leadership training, thoroughly enjoyed it. The last 10 or 12 years of my career, I actually had a job called communications, and I loved it. So I had a little communications team. I wrote presentations. I wrote talking points. I got to stand up and do this because I was a meeting and events planner for my department. It was a ball. And before I retired, it was a fluke. It was during the recession, so it was maybe 2010, 11. Hugh and I live in Dunwoody, Georgia, which is a small suburb outside of Atlanta. And we have a local paper. And the managing editor was leaving and wrote about how the paper really needed the community support and how the local businesses needed community support because we were in a recession, so businesses were closing, the newspaper didn't have advertising income. And I was just moved to write the editor. I wrote 4 articles, and I sent it to the editor who had been an editor for the Atlanta Journal many, many years ago. His name was Dick Williams. And I just wrote him and said, I think you need a cheerleader, and here's 4 articles about what I love about the Crier and what I love about Dunwoody. It took him months to get back to me. I sent it email, snail mail, phone calls. When I'm not busy marketing my books, which when you're a self-published author, you do that too. You don't have a publicist, for goodness sake. Except, maybe my husband who talks about me at the VFW and places like that. That husband, Ink Penn. But when I'm not doing that, I'm writing. How many do I have? Well, I only brought one. Okay. So I really had found my passion. Then I retired, and I started writing the column every week. And when Rich read the description, it occurred to me the other day that I was like the Jungle Book. I accentuate the positive. In my columns, people, in the neighborhood, in the community, they'll stop me and say, when are you going to write about this horrible traffic light? And I go, not my gig. I only write about good stuff. There's plenty of people to complain to the editor and send in letters and write about all the horrible stuff in the world. So I continued to write, and I thought, well, why don't I publish a collection of my columns? So I went through the 5-6 years of columns I had and picked out 25 columns. And, some of my columns are very community specific, but I picked out the ones that weren't. And I think they would resonate with most people, because even if you don't live in a great community where people take care of each other and there are, you know, things to be thankful for, you either wish you did, or you
The
can at
Ink
least say,
Manos,
"Gosh,
which
this
is
my
wonderful. This
maiden name,
makes me
just
feel better."
wouldn't have worked. The sections in the book are a seasonal sampler. And so in there I have something about a summer adventure, but it involves my husband's Romeo Club. Any of you in a Romeo Club? Retired old men eating out? It's so funny. I'd heard that long before he was in one. But we had an adventure on the lake, you know, so there's a story about that. There's stories about, you know, going to the doctor and my doctor saying, you know, the older you get, it's like an old car. You need a lot of maintenance. I did not think that was funny. You know? So there are just, you know, kind of humorous things. Or the deer in the yard. You know, how excited did you get? I saw 2 deer out here. It's like, it doesn't matter that they eat everything in our house. We're the salad bar. It's just nice to see them. There's a section called 4-legged family members. How many of you have pets? Okay, they're just special in our lives, right? But you've had them at some point, right? There's a section, fond family memories, where I write about my mom and my dad, who are no longer with us, and proud to be an American. And I really do. I've written about, you know, World War II veterans and parades, and I do think that's one of the sections that people like the most. And then holiday happenings. When I went and visited with Hugh's VFW post at Christmas last year, I read about the Greek family dinner and invited them to tell me all the things they were looking forward to for their Christmas dinner. So I heard about minced meat pie and, you know, a few other things. So I think you would enjoy most of those. Before I just read a brief We thoroughly enjoyed our trip to Prague and our river cruise to Germany, Austria, and Hungary. The small towns were charming, the ships a dream. But it's the history of these countries, particularly over the last 100 years, that has stayed uppermost in my mind and served to remind me how fortunate I am to live in America. Imagine for a moment living in a country torn asunder first by World War I, then again by World War II, a mere 30 years later. Then layer on top of that the fate of the Czech Republic and Hungary, both occupied first by the Nazis and then the Soviets immediately thereafter. It was not until 1989 that they were freed from communism. For us, our first sobering experience came in Prague during a World War II walking tour. We visited tunnels used by the resistance fighters, saw a film on the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich and the subsequent Nazi retaliation, saw the KGB building, and visited the Jewish quarter. We encountered the stumble stones, bronze plaques embedded in the cobblestones and sidewalks to memorialize the Jews who never returned. And we saw those stones again in Regensburg, Germany. Today in the Czech Republic and in Germany, school children are required to visit a concentration camp during their school years, in the hope that recognizing the past will prevent the occurrence of such atrocities in the future. And as an aside, that just makes me think right now about some of what's going on over here, about wanting to erase some of our history. Soon after the Nazis abandoned Prague, the Russians arrived and established communist rule. As a child, our guide was told Americans did nothing to help the Czechs, that the Russians were their saviors. So I hope you'll take a look at this up there. And then I made a shift. I shifted to fiction. In fact, I told you the other day, I Googled my book. You know, we authors do that every once in a while. I Googled my book and I saw that there was a little blurb in a paper that said, Kathy Manos Penn did a collection of her columns, and then she made a drastic shift to fiction. Well, okay, I didn't think it was that drastic. I was inspired to write a fiction book. Excuse me, the dog was inspired. He gets really upset when I say I wrote the book. I had his DNA done for a Christmas present for Hugh. And I don't know about you guys, but it's kind of hard to give Christmas presents anymore. You know, we keep going. Hugh says if I give him another book. In fact, George Plunkett recommended a book. I gave it to him last year for Christmas, you know, just a bunch of Vietnam books. I don't think he's read all of them yet. But I had Banjo's DNA done, and I started to write a blog about it. And as I was writing it, I went, well, wait a minute, why don't I just write this from Banjo's perspective? Thus was born Lord Banjo, the royal pooch. Banjo discovered he was part Great Pyrenees. And Great Pyrenees, I'm sure you know this, the Great Pyrenees were the royal dogs of France. Louis XIV designated them the royal dogs of France, and Banjo's pretty darn excited about that. So he decided that he was Lord Banjo, and it went from there. So I continued to write about him. Oh, excuse me. He continued to bark, and I typed. That's why the first name on the book is Banjo Penn. And I had a ball with that. So I could not bring Banjo. I mean, we flew. So I couldn't bring Banjo, my 70-pound, part Great Pyrenees, part Golden Retriever, part Australian Shepherd. But hey, Great Pyrenees are the biggest dogs, so they get the most weight, right? I couldn't bring him, but I brought my royal mum, because I'm the royal mum. I have a crown. And I brought with me the royal dad, okay, who has a robe but refused to wear it. I don't know if he thought his Vietnam veteran buddies would just not like him anymore if he wore a royal purple robe. Banjo actually has a royal purple robe. And I brought the royal critter sitter, my friend Beverly. Beverly, part of contribution to this book was when we went to Europe last year, Beverly took care of Banjo. And he wrote me emails. So I asked Beverly if I could have permission to enlarge upon her emails and edit them and make them part of the book. So the royal critter sitter also refused to wear a crown or robe, but she is here. So you'll find things in this book about his DNA, and so it was my foray into fiction. And I think there'll be more dog books. I'm thinking the next book may be Lord Banjo and Princess Puddin'. Princess Puddin' is his little calico cat sister who actually rules the house. How many of you have cats? They do. She sleeps on all his dog beds, huge dog beds. So there's a good bit in here about his diet plan, because Miss Beverly, who was an anatomy and biology teacher and loves dogs, we also refer to her as the dog whisperer, decided he needed to be on a diet. So there's a lot in here about how painful that was for Lord Banjo.